I, like many people of my generation, grew up on Disney films. There's something inherently timeless about them. You don't just remember the ones that came out when you were a child. Chances are you watch all of them, even the ones that came out before your parents were born. And whilst that's not to say that kids don't watch other children's films, I feel like most kids these days would more easily recognise Snow White and Cinderella over Heidi and the Railway Children. And whilst part of that is down to Disney throwing these characters around on anything that has a free, human-shaped space, I do think a lot of parents these days are more likely to put on Sleeping Beauty than The Wizard of Oz. This is probably why a lot of people my age get frustrated with the live-action remakes. Not all, but certainly enough of them, because we still remember the originals fondly, and therefore fall very easily into the argument of, why remake what was already fine? Whilst I probably have fallen into this argument in the past, having now taken the time to think about it, I'm not sure that's an entirely fair response. After all, many of these stories are fairy tales that have existed for many, many, many years and are still being retold to this day. Repackaged into young adult romance, high fantasy, science fiction, and even horror films. So what's wrong with Disney doing it? Well, a lot of that comes down to purpose. Are they actually retelling the story in a fresh, innovative way, or are they just repackaging the same tale as a transparent cash grab? Considering I'm overall not a fan of the live-action remakes, you can probably guess on which side of the fence I've made my camp. Still, it may be worth taking them one by one with as unbiased and receptive approach as I can muster. And their first live-action remake, Alice in Wonderland. I mean, I'm only 14 years late. Let's dive in. Alice in Wonderland started life as a book by Charles Dodgson, better well known as Lewis Carroll. Carroll was a mathematician at Oxford University, keenly interested in logic and puzzles, fond of children, and a writer of poetry. All these were combined into his 1865 novel, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. There is some speculation whether or not Alice in Wonderland is based off of a real girl Carroll knew called Alice Liddell, but he denied this. The acrostic poem at the end of Through the Looking Glass, which spells out her full name, was most likely just a little Easter egg he put in for her, as he was known to do this with other children. For example, Gertrude Chataway's name appears in the same way in his nonsense poem, The Hunting of the Snark. I personally think he called Alice Alice after Liddell, as it was born from a story he told her sister and her whilst on a boat ride, and she then asked him to write down. But the character, perhaps not based on her, just named for her. But no one's really sure, so You can fall down a little bit of a rabbit hole looking into Lewis Carroll and his relationship with the various children he knew and the photos he took. I wouldn't encourage it as a rabbit hole to fall down, but well, let's be honest, you're definitely going to go and Google it now. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland has been reworked across several types of media. TV shows, films, plays, video games, ballets, and is one of the most recognisable stories to parody in other works. The earliest adaptation that I'm aware of was a musical, which premiered in 1886, just 20 years after the book was published. But one thing remained fairly consistent throughout all of these: the bright and balmy world of Wonderland, subject to a set of illogically logical rules and etiquette where animals talk, mushrooms make you grow, and stealing pastry is punishable by death. Enter Walt Disney. Disney had been interested in the Alice stories for a while, and even did a Mickey Mouse short called Through the Mirror. After his success with Snow White, Disney finally acquired the rights he needed and started to storyboard his version of Alice. Mixing together elements from both Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, the resulting film was a bright, whimsical romp still fondly remembered to this day. Which brings us to today. And by that I mean 17 years ago, when Tim Burton agreed to direct a live-action version of Alice in Wonderland. A version in which a grown-up Alice returns to Wonderland. Burton went into this project intending it to be its own separate thing and not a sequel or reimagining of any pre-existing Alice film. Which is fair enough. One of the things I appreciate about the film is that it isn't just a rehash of what's been before. It is, on a fundamental level, its own thing. Burton also said he wanted to give Alice an emotional centre and a clearer story, elements he found lacking in the originals, and I suppose he achieved that in essence. A lot of people were quite excited about this project. The madness of Alice in Wonderland, combined with Burton's distinctive Gothic style, should have resulted in a visual masterpiece. But did it? Visually, the film is alright. I like the parts in the forest with the giant mushrooms because, of course, I'd like that bit. I am slightly obsessed with mushrooms. With looking at them, not eating them. Overall, I like the look of Underland, which may be a throwback to Carol's original title of Alice's Adventures Underground, or because Wonderland was too childish for this serious and epic story. Underland has the feel of a place once beautiful and well kept, but that has since fallen into wreck and ruin. A place abandoned. It sort of gave me Narnia vibes, specifically from Prince Caspian. In Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe, the Pevensies save Narnia from the White Witch, bring back spring, and rule the land with justice and prosperity. When they return in Prince Caspian, it is very different. The Telmarines have invaded, many animals have lost their sentience and powers of speech, and the Pevensies find their old possessions are now ancient relics from a bygone era, festering in an old ruin. Anyway, I liked that element of Underland. If Burton really didn't want to go down the unfocused vignettes of madness route, then giving Underland this distinct feel, heavy with implication of the past, is a pretty good idea. I also like the funny little creatures we sometimes see, like that little rocking horse fly thing. I liked a lot of the designs. The chess piece inspired knights in the battle between the red and white queens at the end were quite cool, and in keeping with the chess theme of Through the Looking Glass. Mad Hatter has a cool pincushion ring that I covet because I'm always losing pins when sewing. And in general, it was clear the costume department really had fun with this film, with all the dresses and that. I like a nice dress in my fantasy film, so they got a big fat tick from me. As for the characters, I quite like the nonsensical way a lot of them spoke, especially the Tweedle twins. Helen Bonham Carter was fine as the Queen of Hearts, mad as a box of frogs, but at least she was mad. My favourite, however, was probably Anne Hathaway as the White Queen. I enjoyed the way she just sort of floated everywhere like an insane fairy. She kind of gave me Scrooged Ghost of Christmas Present vibes, but less violent. Overall, I'm sorry to say I'm not a huge fan of this film, and I think a lot of that comes down to its conception. Whilst I understand Burton's decision to give the story more plot and stronger emotional centres, I don't think he did it well. The problem with trying to give Alice in Wonderland a plot is that the point of the book is that it kind of lacks a plot. It is meant to be this nonsensical, magical land, so far removed from the restrictive life of Victorian England, which Alice struggles to navigate. I suppose the obvious plot to give it would be for Alice to be trying to get back home. She can't go back up the rabbit hole because she can't fly. So she looks for another way, and that's the adventure. Something simple which allows appropriate space for all the madness and the musings to properly breathe. Here, however, we get an epic fantasy with a prophecy and good versus evil and a dragon to slay, and it's just too much. The characters can't be properly zany because the plot is too serious and too complicated to support them, and the plot isn't able to develop into anything more interesting or original because it's constantly battling all these sort of zany characters. It doesn't work, and it actually serves to undermine the point of the book. Now, I'm all for changing these old stories, revamping them to fit new genres or settings or themes, but it has to mesh with the core of the original, and this just doesn't. Instead of something fresh and innovative, which the original Alice very much was, practically launching a new genre, we get a pretty tired and overused story. There's a good guy and a bad guy. There's a prophecy. Alice is the chosen one. She has to find the sword and defeat the evil dragon so the good guys win, like every other fantasy ever. And that's not necessarily a problem. Dragged back to its core elements, it's an ancient story. The problem is that despite having all this stuff to work with from the books, the film does nothing original or fresh or different. But there were other issues, so let's look at those. Firstly, I got very sick very quickly of Alice's whole "this is just a dream" spiel. Very early on, she does this pinching trick that her father taught her, and it doesn't work, so it must be real. But she goes on to insist that Wonderland is a dream for quite a long time afterwards. I also found the whole Alice returns to Underland woefully underused. Like, you could take out the sections about her having been there before and nothing would change. So why didn't they make it relevant? Have her remember her dreams and maybe use her memories from those dreams to navigate the world and help the characters. Alice in general is very weak in this. If the plot had been better, this film still would have sucked for how boring Alice is. She has no personality, shows no emotion, delivers her dialogue with the intonation of wet cardboard. She's just dull to watch. And I feel bad for the actress because I don't know what direction she was given. Maybe she was told to play it like that, but either way, it wasn't good. And when she's your main character and in most of the film, it really makes this a chore. Even in the poster, which is meant to excite people, she's just like, oh, wow, neat, I guess. I also found the Mad Hatter kind of weird. I liked some things about him, but overall I got the impression he was trying to be a bit like the genie from Aladdin. No, not that one. That's the one. Sadly, like Will Smith, he doesn't quite hit the mark. I also found it weird because it felt like he was meant to be not sexy, but kind of desirable in that odd Benedict Cumberbatch sort of a way. I don't know, maybe I'm imagining it, but it weirded me out. That is the danger when your lead is a young, pretty woman and she's playing off Johnny Depp, who, you know, I think most people had a bit of a crush on as Jack Sparrow. The colour scheme is grey, which is maybe not the most inspiring colour palette for an Alice in Wonderland film, but there we go. Sometimes we get bursts of colour, like the Queen of Hearts palace is very red and the White Queen's palace is very white, but like the finale takes place on just grey rocks. Of all the fantastical landscapes you could have chosen, you went for grey rocks. The emotional core that Burton was on about didn't really work. Yes, that's because Alice had all the emotional range of a tin of white paint, but it just didn't feel woven through at all. There's this whole thing of her dad in the opening, and I think the opening scene is genuinely quite good. And then he's dead, but it doesn't feel relevant at all. If the dad was somehow represented in Underland, or maybe she's struggling with the grief and the Jabberwock becomes a sort of metaphor for that. I don't know, but just something to tie in with this emotional core. I suppose they were going for Alice growing as a person through her adventures, becoming more confident in herself. But she doesn't change. She already is confident. In the garden party scene, just before she falls down the rabbit hole, it is shown that she doesn't conform to society's stupid rules. She doesn't wear her corset. She speaks her mind. She talks to the crazy aunt. The ending, therefore, feels very weak. She returns home and delivers some mediocre verbal smackdowns and is for some reason taken seriously, which doesn't ring true because it's 1868 or something. She's a woman, an unmarried woman. People won't take her seriously. They didn't in the opening, and they sure as hell won't at the end. We saw her battling the Jabberwock and saving Underland, but from their perspective, she ran off during a proposal, then returned covered in mud and started talking nonsense. They're not gonna let her take over her dad's merchant business because she's got a muddy skirt and learnt some inappropriate dance moves. If it was something smaller, more personal, based on how she might have changed, maybe it would have been stronger. If she was inspired to go out and join a women's suffrage movement or use her position of relative power, i.e. not dirt poor, to help people. You know, clear, believable changes and not just she says no to the bloke she didn't want to marry in the first place and probably wasn't going to marry anyway and everyone's fine with that. Some other things that annoyed me. Bayard the dog tosses Hatter's hat into the Queen of Hearts castle and Alice has to follow after it by jumping across a manky moat via stepping stones made of severed heads. Why didn't she just stay in the hat and let Bayard throw her across? The little mouse dude, Reapy Cheap Zero, tears out the eye of a Bandersnatch.
You're going to take someone's eye out.
Later on, Alice returns the Bandersnatch's eye, which makes it good. How the hell did she know that was going to work? There were no hints, just on a whim, decides to give it back, and I'm no doctor, but I don't think that's how eyes work. You can't just plug it back in, it's not a freaking toaster. I didn't like the Jabberwock talking. Not sure why, it just took me by surprise in a bad way. And on that note, it's Jabberwock, not Jabberwocky. Not a fan of this one. It just felt too far removed from the core of the original and tried to make up for it with a stylised nothingness of a plot. But to be fair, I'm not massive on the original one either. Like Burton said, it's a little too meandering and aimless for my tastes. And in part, I think it's down to the book just being very difficult to adapt. It's not just the zaniness that it's important to capture, but the tone, and the films have, just for me, never quite managed it. The book is hilarious because it's written with this very typical British humour. The way that Alice approaches various problems is so ridiculous and yet so matter-of-factly stated. Of course, running around in circles is the most sensible way to dry off. If a bottle isn't labelled poison, then it must be safe to drink. The films never quite managed to get that, and I think it's partly because a book has narration, where it can organically tell us Alice's thought processes, but films can't do that in the same way without it sounding a bit weird. Maybe it's because both Disney films were written and made by Americans who didn't quite get the Britishness of the original stories. Either way, it's a shame that Burton's version didn't become the cinematic masterpiece we were all expecting it to be, especially in the light of Walt Disney's interest in the book. As he once said in American Weekly in 1946, "No story in English literature has intrigued me more than Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. It fascinated me the first time I read it as a schoolboy." Whilst the original animated film isn't my favourite, you at least get a sense of Disney's love and fascination with the story. The 2010 live action, however, took the names-ish of the characters and tried to take them as far away from the original as possible. And that is a shame.
Welcome to Wonderland, the leading star is Plant, and everything you spy is all just CGI, an epic fantasy, topped with a prophecy, a war to become queen, or was it just a dream?